of there being any driver's license. That also would change the donation concept. Various other sorts of incentives. Several states have suggested, have passed laws in which burial costs are paid for organ donors. There's a discussion in California right now, California Medical Society, about giving organ donors, people who have stated that they will give an organ, a higher place on the list if they themselves become candidates for organs. So these are many concepts which are attempting to shift the idea of, in a sense, the moral basis of transplantation away from donation as such. Some not very far, because these incentives also are based upon donation, but still the idea we would probably get more organs if we thought differently. And yet the concept of altruism, the concept of donation, plays an extraordinarily important part in the world of transplantation. A recent book on the history of transplantation, Tilney's book called Transplant from Myth to Reality, which was published last year, says altruism in organ donation has been the linchpin of transplantation since its inception. The gift of life is a concept that comforts many donor families faced with sudden and tragic death of a relative, and allows them solace by realizing that the organs and tissues of someone they loved may live on in another. This story of a particular development in Catholic moral theology then has had a significant impact in the way in which we think about this major field. But also, it is in itself a very interesting example of the evolution of a doctrine within Catholic moral theology. It's an example of enfolding the individual morality that was seen in the issue of transplantation, of mutilation, in the larger morality of a social context, and a very interesting example of the way in which Catholic moral theologians had come to see society and community not in a totalitarian sense, in which individuals are mere parts of the whole, but rather as a dynamic reality brought together and put together by the human interactions of charity and gifting and love. Thus far, the story of transplantation as a moral issue. Thank you very much. And I suppose we have time for some questions. One of the obvious kinds of questions is, how does this apply to anything else? And there have been some anything else's around recently. Yes?
I have two questions. The first relates to whether the Catholic Church was a leader or a follower when compared with other faiths, either their own evolution toward their perception of transplantation. And the second one relates to the doctrines you were citing for the Church, and where would blood transfusion come in?
Right. The first one is a fairly easy question to answer, and that is that the Catholic Church was pretty much the leader, because other churches had almost no developed doctrine about mutilation, or in general, not much doctrine to speak of in medical issues. There was not much interest in medical morality. There is a principle in Jewish thought which was very easily adaptable, very much like the principle of totality, which says that all moral rules that forbid actions are subordinated to the rule that requires the saving of human life. So that's a very ancient principle in Jewish moral thought that could clearly be brought to bear. The second question that you asked about transplantation was in fact, about transfusion, was in fact discussed by the moral theologians through in the 1920s and 30s when transfusion was just beginning to be developed again. And their answer to that is a kind of a little trick. They say, well, mutilation consists of depriving a person of some essential function, but blood is self-restorative. So if you give a person blood, you are giving them a transplantation from another, but very quickly that becomes part of the person's body, and the person then begins to produce from the bone marrow and blood cells. So they say, that's okay. And they never had any serious problem with transfusion. Dr. Elliott.
To Bob's, that was Cunningham, wasn't it? No, okay. To the question about what the Protestants were doing, your approach, and I'm speaking as a Lutheran now, so some of you would consider a Protestant. For Protestants, their moral basis is Scripture. And so where Scripture speaks on a topic, fine. And where it doesn't, they're kind of in limbo on it, to use a Catholic term. And so part of the problem for the Protestants was, where could we find in Scripture anything that would be related to this? And I was watching the way you began your talk, and maybe it slipped by some of you, but Al and I used to teach moral theology together at this place, and I've been watching him for a long time on this. He started telling us about developments in the field of science before he got to theology, which in his way of looking at things, is always taking seriously what we're learning about nature. But in a Protestant approach to things, you don't begin with what's happening in the natural world and how do we think about it theologically, but what does the Bible say about it, and what are we going to do about it? And so there's a real difference in the way Protestant theologians and moralists and Catholic theologians and moralists go about looking at things, which made it always, for me, a delight to be at this Jesuit university to do moral theology, because we got along much more easily. And so he talked about development, which is a natural way of seeing things. So thanks, Al.
Thank you very much, Jack. That's perfect. Linda.
I am interested in the concept of mutilation and how that relates to circumcision.
Yes. Very good question. How does the concept of mutilation relate to circumcision?
In moral, I mean Catholic moral.
In Catholic moral thinking. The one feature of the definition of mutilation in Catholic moral theology is that the excision of whatever has been done must deprive a person of function. For many centuries, it was considered that male circumcision didn't deprive anybody of any function. It was a ceremonial act, and certainly it's a part of both in Judaism and in Islam. It's not a ceremonial act in Christianity, but became a custom. But it was considered, in fact, to be a positive act in some ways because it was considered hygienically advisable in the world, in the Western scientific world. But it didn't deprive of any particular function. That does not apply in any appropriate way to female circumcision, which is, of course, a very serious matter. And that appears to be that it would fulfill much more directly the concept of mutilation because it does deprive and, in fact, seriously injures certain functions.